As we've talked about many times on this channel, J.R.R. Tolkien was the originator of fantasy as we understand the term today. One of the more enduring of his ideas is the enmity between dwarves and elves. Invariably, in any setting that features these two races, you're bound to find members of each of these races fostering bitter resentments towards each other. In Tolkien's history, the dwarves and elves originally had a falling out over the creation of works of jewelry, specifically one type of jewel called the Nauglamir. The elven king Thingol of the Teleri elves commissioned the dwarves of Belegost to make jewelry, and with the necklace of Nauglamir set aside for holding a Silmaril. When the dwarves actually finished the creation, they became so enamored with it that they refused to hand it over. In his anger, Thingol insults the dwarves, and then a fight breaks out, ultimately resulting in a war and eternal enmity on both sides. This is of course why it's so important that Legolas and Gimli become friends and true companions during their quest to destroy the One Ring. Tolkien is talking not only about rejecting greed, but also how people can set aside their baser natures and work together in working against greed and the domination of power. In the classic way that Games Workshop often borrows, some might say appropriates, from Tolkien's work, this same enmity is repeated in the foundational mythology of the Warhammer fantasy world. In true Games Workshop fashion, however, it's taken up to 11. It's called the War of Vengeance, or perhaps the War of the Beard, depending on who you ask. It shook the foundations of the Warhammer world and arguably sowed the seeds for many, many terrible things in its future. And of course, the elves were always going to lose it.
Baby, don't you know it? I'm hardly heroic. Baby, let's roll it, 'cause I'm hardly heroic.
To understand the War of the Beard, I think it's first important to look at some context. This war is 2,000 years before the birth of Sigmar, in an era of Warhammer history that some might think of as the Golden Age. The two preeminent powers of the world, the High Elves of Ulthuan and the Dwarves of the World's Edge Mountains, these were expanding their civilizations and producing mighty empires. For the High Elves, this meant building many overseas colonies and trading posts, and especially this meant building colonies in the Old World. In fact, many of those elven colonies would form the basis of future human cities. For the dwarves, their own civilization was flourishing as they expanded their control of the great mountain ranges of the Old World. In some sense, this is an ideal situation. These two powers were not in direct competition with one another. The elves had little interest in building colonies or cities where the dwarves preferred to live, and vice versa. In many ways, friendship between these two races flourished, and the two peoples might have reached the apex of their power and influence over the world. There is this idea in economics called comparative advantage, and it's basically the idea that if a given economy can produce something for a lower cost than its competitors, it should. If every economy specializes in producing things that it's best at, and you can foster trade between them, then the overall economic productivity and efficiency is greater than if everybody tried to make everything. Now granted, this is not something that is a universal maxim. You can't only just produce a single thing, you have to produce other stuff. But generally, if you try to specialize in making some things, you can trade with your neighbors, and everyone can benefit. This is best demonstrated by the elves and the dwarves. The elves are fine craftsmen, but the dwarves are the best craftsmen in the world, who are also able to mine for the minerals and resources that they need to make those things. Elves, on the other hand, are excellent traders, seafarers, and magic users, which enable them to produce a wider variety of trade goods that dwarves might want, like textiles, in exchange for their own products, like metalworking. Suffice to say, things were pretty good, so this being Warhammer, they would not stay that way for long. Enter Malekith. Malekith was the leader of a rogue faction of elves within Ulthuan who desired the Phoenix throne for himself. Basically, he wanted to be king. He had tried to seize the throne, but failed, and was weakened potentially, with his followers and himself going into exile on the continent of Nagaroth. In order to best facilitate his return to power, he needed to weaken the elves and their potential allies. What better way than to exploit the pride and vanity of both races? So he engineered a scheme whereby dark elves, dressed as high elves, would attack a dwarf caravan and take their goods. This false flag operation would then prompt the king of the dwarves, Gotrek Starbreaker, to demand compensation for the attack from the king of the elves, Kalador II. Now, as an aside, the elves are always led by Phoenix King. Elves mark the passage of time by the different reigns of the different Phoenix Kings. This king, Kalador II, was called the Warrior. Unlike his father, Kalador I, who was renowned as both a king, a warrior, and a diplomat, Kalador II was extremely proud and arrogant. Although he had all of his father's skills as a fighter, he learned little in the way of the social graces that might be needed to rule. Thus, when Gotrek Starbreaker sent ambassadors to demand recompense for the false flag attack, Caledor II refused them, insulted them, and finally shaved their beards, which is an act that's extremely dishonorable for a dwarf. So then, war would be declared. At the start of this video, I said that the elves were always going to lose. With the precursor of the war out of the way, allow me to explain why. Firstly, when we think about the course of the war, geography is a foundational issue. The bulk of the elves lived in Ulthuan, an island that's very far away from the Old World, whereas the bulk of the dwarves lived in mountain strongholds in the Old World itself. I don't think it's possible for the dwarves to countenance a naval invasion of Ulthuan, for dwarves are not as interested in seafaring, and seafaring in this era is not as advanced as it would be in the future. It's possible that they might have at some point, but at the onset of the war, they weren't. The main objective for the dwarves, as seen by their military movements, is to attack the elven cities in the Old World and burn them down. So naturally, this means that the elves are on the back foot, as they must move their armies from their island to attack the dwarves, whereas the dwarves simply have to move from their mountain keeps to attack the elven cities, which are nearby. The first victory of the war, the one that destroyed Cor Veneth, an elven city, was accomplished by dwarves moving from various keeps in such a way. Furthermore, during this time, the dwarven tunnel network, which they had built to connect their realm, is still fully operational. It would be possible for dwarves to rely on these networks to move their troops around without having to fear for attacks from the elves, especially attacks from the air, such as from dragons. The logistical strain of having to defend your far-out colonies against attacks on ostensibly home territory of your enemy is not to be discounted. We know that the elves are masters of magic and seafaring, but that doesn't mean that their logistical challenges were easily overcome. The second major problem is the nebulous nature of their war goals. In the short term at least, the dwarven objective of destroying elven cities was very possible. They had already done this a few times during the course of the war. Ulthuan itself, of course, was untouchable from the perspective of the dwarves, but the same is also true for the dwarven strongholds. There are, however, important fault lines. Namely, the elven colonies in the Old World are strategically much easier to attack than Ulthuan itself, and losing them would break the elven foothold in the Old World itself. So we can imagine then that by destroying the elven cities in the Old World, that would be a sufficient proxy goal for the dwarves, whereas the elves have to defend those cities and also somehow strike at dwarven strongholds, which we know they cannot do easily. This gives the dwarves the defensive advantage, both in a military and strategic sense. Given that Caledor II was impulsive, it also meant that he would invariably be drawn into the battle and come to the Old World, further imperiling the cause of the High Elves should he be slain. One of the few places that was able to resist dwarven siegecraft was Tor Alessi. Without access to black powder weapons, which the dwarves would develop in the future, dwarven war machines were not up to the task of completely breaching the city, so it had to be placed under siege several times, only for the elven army to try and break that siege, relieving the force. During the 14th siege of Tor Alessi, King Gotrek Starbreaker actually fought Caledor II in martial combat, and of course, where Gotrek killed Caledor II, he took his crown as a prize, more or less bringing the war to a close. For the elves, with their king dead, Malekith saw his chance to launch his own attack on Ulthuan, which forced all of the elves to abandon their war with the dwarves, as well as abandon their colonies in the Old World. The major dwarven cities remained intact, which further indicates that the elven task of defeating the dwarves was impossible at that time. So in terms of the outcomes, the elves had lost their king, who had started the war, the majority of their colonies, and suffered huge losses, which would be in turn exacerbated by a fresh invasion of Ulthuan by Malekith. For the dwarves, they had also suffered significant losses, and they were weakened, although the biggest damage would come to them from the subsequent Greenskin and Skaven invasions of their realm. That's the real tragedy of the War of the Beard, although it's still definitely the fault of the elves. The demands of the dwarves for an explanation of the attack on their traders was a reasonable one. We know that the dwarven ambassadors tried to reason with Caledor II, but his ego would not let him entreat the dwarves as equals. Invariably, the elves ended up destroying the prosperity of both races due to the vanity of their king, and in the process allowing greater blights to plague the world. That's not to say that the dwarves should have definitely embarked on a war campaign, but given that we know that both races were incredibly proud, and of course that from the dwarven perspective they had assumed that the elves had attacked them, their impetus for war is a little bit more understandable than the elven impetus for war. Finally, I'd like to end this video with some speculation about the possible endgames for either faction had Caledor II not been killed. For the elves, I do not believe that they would have been able to successfully attack any of the dwarven settlements, at least not any of the major ones. We know from later material that the major threats to dwarven strongholds are invariably from below and from within, from groups like Skaven or the Greenskins, who are able to tunnel fight significantly better. Both factions are also extremely numerous, and more than willing to throw away dozens upon dozens of warriors for even centimeters of ground. The elves, bereft of their advantages of mobility, coupled with their lower relative numbers, and of course lack of experience in dealing in tunnel fighting, would probably put them at a severe disadvantage in a siege of the dwarven Karax. Instead, I think if the elves wanted to win the war, they would have to resort to magic. I think in desperation, the elves might have tried to execute a spell to break the World's Edge Mountains. In the lore, one of the greatest calamities to befall the Dwarven Empire was a series of earthquakes that broke their underground tunnel system and their defenses. These earthquakes were caused by mage priests of the Lizardmen, the Slann, in order to readjust the geography of the world, in keeping with the grand designs of the enigmatic, but disappeared, Old Ones. I think there was a possibility that the elves could have been the ones to do this. In their desperation, and of course in possible madness, they tried to execute a spell that would break the Dwarven mountain strongholds as a way of breaking the deadlock that they had fallen into. Whether or not they would have succeeded is definitely another question. For the dwarves, I cannot imagine that there would be any successful naval invasion of Ulthuan. This is the era before the invention of dwarven flying machines, and of course their more famous ironclads. So I imagine that using wooden sailing ships to sail a force to Ulthuan to land them would only result in the elves either beating them with a superior navy, which the elves are famous for, or them all getting roasted to death by dragonfire. Instead, the dwarves could have achieved, or rather did achieve by proxy, their major war goal. By the end of the war, the elves had left the old world, leaving the dwarves ostensibly in charge. Their major target, I think, would have been to destroy the forest of Ethel Loren, something which the magical forest might have resisted with extreme prejudice, but at least it was more doable. So, thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this one. Let me know what you think about it, about which side that you fall into in the War of the Beard. Be sure to like and subscribe and all of that, and tell me what you think who should have won the War of the Beard. I hope that I've made the case that the elves have never had a chance.